Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This is a Woman podcast. I am your host, Sophia Lorey, and I got back this week from being in Washington, D.C., outside the Supreme Court for their oral arguments on two cases around girls' sports. I was able to speak at a press conference with 9 attorney generals and Riley Gaines, Jennifer Say, Michaela Skinner, Macy Petty, some amazing female athletes that have been speaking out on this issue. And it was a great trip. If you don't already follow This is a Woman podcast on Instagram, that's where you can see the constant updates, highlights, what is going on. But just like I told you all last episode, when I kind of gave you a brief overview of the two Supreme Court cases, we are diving into a whole recap this episode about what went on in the over 3 hours of oral arguments at the Supreme Court, what was said, and I'm not alone today to break it all down to you guys. I actually have a friend coming on, Brittany Jones, who is an attorney, and she was there inside the courts, heard and saw firsthand what the Supreme Court justices were saying. She's also the president of Kansas Family Voice. So, how I am the outreach director and work at California Family Council, she is with our sister organization in Kansas, where she has worked on girls' sports bills there, and she has done it all. I'm going to link below to the website of Kansas Family Voice, where you guys can read her entire bio because she's done it all. But I want to read this one part of her bio that I just think is so fun. And so not only is she the president of Kansas Family Voice and an attorney, but Brittany got her start in politics when she was 7 years old and has been actively involved in campaigns, state government, and grassroots efforts ever since. Her media appearances include CNN, Good Morning America, ABC Australia, The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, World Magazine, and many others. And so she actually was an intern at Family Research Council, just like I was forever ago now. But we are going to walk through what the cases are, what was said in the oral arguments, what we believe is to come as the result of these oral arguments. You are going to hear some clips. We're going to listen some clips of the Supreme Court justices and attorneys talking in the case. But with that, let's just dive right into it. Well, hello, Brittany, and welcome to This is a Woman podcast. We're so excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this important case.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of the followers have seen our little social media clips from before the Supreme Court hearing, at the Supreme Court hearing, and, Brittany, we watched a lot go down in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court with these two cases on girls' sports, and you were there, you were in the courts, you are an attorney, and I just want to break down and walk through what that day was like, some of the great things we heard in court, some of the kind of crazy things we heard in court. I mean, it was over 3.5 hours of oral arguments that day that you guys sat in there. So before we kick all that off, could you give us a little brief overview of the two cases we have, the Little v. Hecox and the state of West Virginia versus BPJ?
Yes. So oftentimes when you have cases that are on similar topics, they will do what they call consolidation. So they'll put the two of them together. So the issues are together, the oral arguments are together. But for this one, they didn't. They kept them separate. So they are both about state laws that are Fairness in Women's Sports Act. Idaho was the first one, which is first state in the nation to pass Fairness in Women's Sports Act. And that is the Little versus Hecox case. And so that case, the only question that was being asked by the court was, does a state passing a law that restricts that ensures that men aren't in women's sports, does that violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? So it was a constitutional law question, and that was it. Now, the second case, which is the West Virginia versus BPJ, was about a West Virginia law, the Fairness of Women's Sports Act from West Virginia. And that case asked the question of, does this law violate the 14th Amendment? But also, what does Title IX say about this law? And so in the oral arguments, you kind of heard some distinctions in a little bit of the arguments, very similar, but in the Little versus Hecox argument, which is the first argument, they mainly talked about the 14th Amendment. And then in the West Virginia versus BPJ argument, which was the second half of the 3.5 hours, was all about the Title IX, a little bit of equal protection, but mainly about Title IX and how that statute is written and what it means going forward.
Amazing. And I think when people are talking about this whole issue of men and women's sports, people know about Title IX. It's a very familiar thing. A lot of people might not know about the equal protection and everything like that. So, can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the Equal Protection Clause says that similarly situated people needed to be treated equally. If you need to be treated just like a woman in most circumstances. A lot of the times we see equal protection show up in the race context. So you get different levels of scrutiny based on which kind of quote unquote discrimination that you're talking about. So alleged racial discrimination, that's going to get strict scrutiny. But when you're looking at something like sex discrimination, that's when you start looking at, okay, does it get heightened scrutiny? Does it get intermediate scrutiny? And essentially, intermediate scrutiny says you cannot treat them differently unless there's a compelling reason, unless there's a very exceedingly important reason. And so normally what we've said when it comes to sex discrimination is there are spaces where being a woman means that you get treated differently, and that's a good thing. Women's spaces should be protected, and that's kind of always been the understanding of what we look at when we're looking at equal protection conversation when it comes to sex. There actually are no good reasons for racial discrimination, but there can be there are things about our biology that mean we show up in the world differently, and that states and courts are allowed to protect those things. And so that was the whole conversation around the 14th Amendment. It's very complicated. There's a lot of really just a lot of legalese that goes into the 14th Amendment conversation. But at the heart of it is there a reason that matters? It doesn't matter that I'm showing up in a space. Does my biology make a difference in this space? And is that something the court should protect?
And especially on the sports issue, that's our whole argument is there is a huge difference between males and females in our biology, and that's why volleyball nets for males are 7 inches higher than female. That's why when you see different running and track competitions, men have faster times. I mean, it directly aligns with perfectly our arguments on the situation. And so those are the two cases. And I want to get into all of the fun about being at the day and what you heard. But you submitted something with Renee Carlson of True North Legal that goes to the Supreme Court for these cases. It's an amicus brief. What is an amicus brief, and what was entailed in your and Renee's amicus brief?
An amicus brief is simply a friend of the court brief. It is not a main brief. It is not essential to the argument, but you are bringing a different perspective. You are bringing some sort of value to the case. And you'll see amicus briefs at all sorts of levels of the legal system, but you see them mostly at the Supreme Court. And so the amicus brief that Renee Carlson and I submitted was all about the arguments that we're making at the state level. So it was submitted on behalf of Representative Barb E. Hart from Idaho, who was the first sponsor of the original Fairness in Women's Sports Act. And it was joined by 206 female legislators from states who most of them have either passed a Fairness in Women's Sports Act or they have taken some sort of vote on it. They've just supported in different ways by either introducing a bill if they can't get a vote on it. But it was all legislators who have supported these laws, as well as 38 family policy councils from around the country who have been the major drivers of these laws at the state level. And so the brief was all about literally these arguments we're making every day, that there are not always differences that matter between men and women, but when it comes to the issue of sports, when it comes to the issues of private spaces, there are differences between men and women that matter and that should be protected. And it talked about the exceedingly important history of Title IX. It literally told stories of legislators from across the country whose lives were changed by Title IX. One example, of course, is Representative Barb E. Hart, who was a college basketball star as well as a college basketball coach. And we contrasted her story with legislator from Kansas, Representative Barb Wassinger, who is a good friend of mine, who was born just a few years too early to benefit from Title IX. And she talked about her experience of not being able to really participate fully in sports and the difference it made in her life. And so it was just a really beautiful thing to not only talk about the biology, talk about the statistics, but to really tell those women's stories. And I heard a couple different segments in the justices' arguments that showed that they had been paying attention to those stories. And that was really neat.
I love that. And I love that you guys did that contrast in these briefs. I mean, I think sometimes we forget that Title IX hasn't been around for 250 years. It hasn't been around this whole time. It's frequent enough that the women that fought for it are watching women right now erase it. And it's really disturbing. And so it's important to highlight how much women gained from Title IX and those protections. And so I love that you guys put that in there. Real quick, a lot of the listeners are very caught up on where we're at with the issue of protecting girls' sports in California. And so you're in Kansas doing what I'm doing here in California. You know, we have 27 states that are protecting girls' sports right now, 23 that are not. Could you maybe give us a quick rundown of where you're at in Kansas on the girls' sports issue?
So if you don't know, Kansas is a very conservative state with a very liberal governor. And so we have a super majority of Republicans in our House and our Senate, and we have a liberal governor who vetoes almost every bill we pass. So it's really fun times over here. But in 2023, we finally passed the Fairness Women's Sports Act after 3 tries. She had vetoed the law 3 times. Senator Renee Erickson from Kansas is the one who carried the bill. I think she debated it 11 times before we were finally able to override the governor's veto. And so we do have a fairness women's sports law in Kansas. It has not been challenged, I think, because they know they would lose. And so that law is in effect in Kansas. And so that experience really helped us write this brief. We were able to talk through those arguments. We were able to weave the arguments that we used in the legislature into this brief the goal was to help the justices understand why we were passing these laws, like why they mattered, why they mattered to not only athletes, but why they mattered to the entire scope of the law and how they were affecting real people. And so it was a really fun brief to write because it paired my policy brain with my legal brain and got to put it all together in one brief.
We will link that brief in the show notes so people can read it, check it out for themselves. And, you know, now like you said, you heard some conversation, some debate during those oral arguments that shows these justices are reading the briefs, are paying attention to what is being submitted. And so we're going to get to that. But a lot of people, you know, there's a lot that goes into the Supreme Court. And they're hearing these cases. Can anyone go in and hear what the Supreme Court's saying during oral arguments? Walk us through that. Walk us through how you got in. I mean, I just think it's so fun to hear kind of what goes into all of that.
Yes. So technically anyone can go to the Supreme Court and listen, but there's a process. Like anything with the government, they have 2 different lines. So they have a lawyer's line if you're submitted to the bar of the Supreme Court, and then they have a line for the general public. And then now they've started doing an online lottery, so you can register and hope to get to win the lottery for that day and get in. I should have done it for this argument, but I didn't because I thought I'd get in just fine. So normally the lawyer line is a lot shorter, and the general public line, you've got people that they literally will pay people to sit in line for them because people get there the night before for these big arguments, sometimes days before, and they'll camp out on the sidewalk. It's quite the experience in the line for the general public. I was in that line one time before I got admitted to the bar, and it was quite an experience. You are in line with people from very different walks of life. I think the first time I was in that line, there was a couple who had flown over from Australia, and they were doing a tour of the United States, and they were lawyers in Australia, and they wanted to see how our court system worked. It was very interesting to chat with them. It was an abortion case and they were not on our side on it, but that's okay. We had a nice conversation at 5 a.m. sitting in the line. But normally the lawyer's line is a little bit shorter. It moves a little bit faster. This particular case, we got there earlier than normal because we were concerned the line would be long. And I think we were like the 12th people in the line at 5 a.m. And we were able to eventually make it in. as Sophia knows, we almost did not make it into the court. There was a little bit of line reshuffling that happened once we got inside, but there was a very wonderful gentleman who I'm 95% sure is a believer, who was just so kind and gracious and found a spot for us. And so we were able to watch the entire argument from the inside. Once you get inside, they take your phone, they take your watch, they take literally every electronic item that you might have. You can go in with a notepad and a pen, but for 3.5 hours, it was very odd to not be able to talk to anybody, to not to be able to check on anyone. But it was also nice because you can just focus on the arguments. It's a beautiful room with all of these just incredible sculptures and these beautiful tapestries. There's just a lot of there's a lot of weight to the room. You can feel how important and how meaningful the things that happen in that room are. And the justices sit up on a little dais above everybody, but they have these big black chairs, and Justice Alito likes to lean back in his like this. They all have their little quirks that when you watch them enough, you figure out this is just a day in the office for them. And then the attorney sit at a table right in front of where the justices are. And so the attorneys are kind of looking up at the justices. I think the cool thing that I got to be near this time was the sketch artist. Because there's no video recording, it's only audio, there are sketch artists who sketch the arguments. And so I got to watch her do her work this time, and that was really neat to see her put all the colors together and show different angles of the justices and of the advocates. And so there's always something new and neat that's going on inside the courtroom. And I would encourage anyone to find out when an argument is happening and try to make an effort to get inside at some point.
And I love hearing all that because, when you're talking about these cases, when the news is talking about them, it can get very divisive. It's getting to just some of the extreme things that were said, which are necessary to talk about. But I think we sometimes lose sight that this is the highest court of the land here, and how beautiful it is, and the history that there is in it, and everything that goes into that. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brittany, but from what I've heard, they even, once you get into the courtroom, they separate you, or they try to sit you on the side that you stand with, or which side you're on of the case. Is that how that plays out? Or
No, you're all just mixed in together.
okay.
Now the advocates are on two different sides,
Yes.
but you can be seated next to anyone.
Okay.
I was seated next to some coaches from a college that came to watch this go around, but some of the transgender advocates were literally right across the way from me. So, I mean, it is a very interesting assortment of people.
Yeah, there you go. So your notepad might look very different than the notes the person next to you is taking, or the
Yes.
emotions they're feeling. Something we talked about right after is, I don't know if I would have lasted 3 hours in that courtroom with some of the things these justices were saying. I think at some moments I would have wanted to stand up and applaud them. At other moments I would have been so frustrated. And so I'm sure it also just takes a lot of self-control to sit there for 3 hours and hear the great things, but also some of the nonsense spewed. And so I want the listeners to hear directly from the Supreme Court justices themselves some of the things they're saying. We'll chat about that. And then we're going to dive into all the other things you heard that day. But one of my favorite clips from this whole hearing was from Justice Alito really laying down the line about defining sex, defining man and woman. And so let's hear what he had to say about this himself.
Well, to pick up on the issue of discrimination on the basis of transgender status, let me go to some basics. Do you agree that a school may have separate teams for a category of students classified as boys and a category of students classified as girls?
Yes, Your Honor.
If it does that, then is it not necessary for there to be, for equal protection purposes, if that is challenged under the Equal Protection Clause, an understanding of what it means to be a boy or a girl, or a man or a woman?
Yes, Your Honor.
And what is that definition? For equal protection purposes, what does it mean to be a boy or a girl, or a man or a woman?
Sorry, I misunderstood your question. I think that the underlying enactment, whatever it was, the policy, the law, we'd have to have an understanding of how the state or the government was understanding that term to figure out whether or not someone was excluded. We do not have a definition for the court, and we don't take issue with We're not disputing the definition here. What we're saying is that the way it applies in practice is to exclude birth sex males categorically from women's teams, and that there's a subset of those birth sex males where it doesn't make sense to do so according to the state's own interest.
Well, how can a court determine whether there's discrimination on the basis of sex without knowing what sex means for equal protection purposes?
I think here we just know that we basically know that that they've identified, pursuant to their own statute, Lindsay qualifies as a birth sex male, and she's being excluded categorically from the women's teams as the statute. So we're taking the statute's definitions as we find them, and we don't dispute them. We're just trying to figure out, do they create an equal protection problem?
All right, suppose this.
Brittany, I want to know all about what was going through your mind as you were hearing the ACLU attorney, the attorney defending men in girls' sports, basically not admit to not being able to define what a man or a woman is, and kind of alluding to that it's irrelevant to this case. It is so relevant to this case. What was going through your mind when you heard all of this play out?
Well, we have to back up for a second. That if you've read the 14th Amendment, it says on the basis of sex, right? And I mean, you read the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and then you read Title IX that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. But yet this attorney decides that we don't need to define what sex means. The entire room, half the room, you could almost see this. What? And the justices kind of I mean, even Justice Gorsuch, who was kind of interesting in this argument, just had this really skeptical look on their face. And this attorney, I don't know, I'm assuming this was a strategy of his, but it was almost you couldn't get your hands on his argument. He would say, well, this is sex discrimination, but let's not define sex, or it's not about gender identity, but it's all about gender identity. And it was almost like this sleight of hand he kept trying to do. And so when Alito asked this question, I mean, it just nailed him. And he tried to slither out of it, but I mean, he had lost so much credibility by the time you asked that question that the whole room, you're like, well, that was not the way to respond to Justice Alito on that question.
Yes. And a lot of times when you're hearing things like this, I mean, the day after the Supreme Court oral arguments on this, we heard an OBGYN say in a congressional hearing that she can't say that men can't get pregnant. And so it really gets me thinking, do some of these people really believe this, or are they that bought into idolizing this gender ideology that they'll say anything? Because you go ask a preschooler what is the difference between a boy and a girl, and they can tell you the answer. So to watch an attorney stand before the Supreme Court, I mean, that's one of those moments where I would have wanted to stand up and just applaud Justice Alito, because I mean, everyone watches that happen, and in my mind, they lost it right then and there.
Yeah. We were 2 hours into the argument by that point. And it had been kind of long, and there had been moments when they had gotten lost in some weeds, and you're like, this is so simple. And Justice Alito brought it back to that core issue. And I think, that's a great question of do they really believe this? And I really think so much of the argument here is they were trying to learn lessons from the Scrimeti case from last year. So last year, there was the case about whether we can ban gender procedures and gender interventions for children. It was the advocate was a transgender individual herself. The attorney's name was Chase Strangio, a biological female who claims to be a male. And it was super obvious. If you look at Chase, clearly a woman, sounds like a woman, but dresses like a man. And so I think that they had so pushed the issue. They're going to be all out transgender. We're going to do all the things in that particular case. And they lost so incredibly badly that this case, they were trying to sound more reasonable. They were trying to not be so hard line. And so there were several times that the attorney for the ACLU made concessions that if you really bought into, if you were a true believer, you would never have made, but then he would back off of them. And so it's such an interesting thing, similar to what happened the next day in that hearing that you're talking about, where they know that they will lose medical credibility by saying that men can get pregnant, but they also can't not say it because the ideologues and the activists will come after them. And so they're kind of caught in the middle here instead of just speaking the truth, believing the truth, and not being pressured by the bullies and not being pressured by the activists on the other side, they really wind up sounding very stupid. And these are not stupid people. They're not. But because they have been deluded by the lie, they've given themselves over to it.
Absolutely. And that's why, like, I always say, just speak the truth. Don't cave to other people, because you said it. You will end up sounding stupid even if you are not a stupid person. I mean, that's what we watched play out a lot in the oral arguments that day. I mean, we have Supreme Court Justice KBJ, and she is, for all of you listening that are like, wait, who's that? She is the woman that, while she was in the process of becoming a Supreme Court Justice and going through everything like that, said that she could not define what a woman is because she is not a biologist. And I'm not a veterinarian. I can tell you the difference between a dog and a cat. Some things are just common sense. And so, honestly, you hear her speaking up there, and then you have this realization, am I smarter than a Supreme Court justice? Because some of the things she said were
Mhm.
absolutely insane. And so she went on this tangent about, this whole idea of men and women being separate is like this first order discrimination. Now we're seeing people like cis women not wanting trans women, and mind you, this is her language. In sports, that's second order discrimination. And so let's hear from Justice KBJ herself on this nonsense.
We're indifferent to a person's gender identity in applying the law.
But the law actually operates differently, I think, for cisgender women and transgender women. That is, with respect to their desire to play on a team that matches their gender identity. Cisgender women can do it, transgender women cannot. And so we do appreciate a distinction, I think, that is being drawn on the basis of your gender status, gender identity status, trans or cis, right?
So, and I want to make sure I understand
Yes.
if we're operating in Title IX world or equal protection world, because I think it might make a difference to the answer. But
Okay. Let's start with Title IX.
So Title IX, I think the question of, I look at this statute and see a distinction between boy and girl indifferent to gender identity. And I think that...
Right, but I'm testing that proposition, right? You see that distinction, and I see it too on the separation of teams level at the beginning.
Right, and I think what I'm hearing is that distinction arises from a difference in effect, and I don't see a disparate impact analysis that's sort of hidden away in Title IX.
But why is that a difference in effect? So it's like a second order discrimination, right? The first order is separating male from female.
Right.
The second order is separating transgender women from cisgender women, right?
Respectfully, I would disagree.
No.
Your Honor.
Okay, Brittany, I see that and I'm thinking, does she just want one open category for everyone? Like, the Paralympics and the Olympics, let's just combine it together because everything is discrimination. What were you thinking when you started to talk like that?
And I think that the coolest part about being in this argument was when they would say things like this, brought to mind actual discussions we had in the legislature when we were trying to pass our law. Like, that is literally a conversation I had with a Democratic representative from Kansas. He was like, it just needs to be sports. Just let it be sports. And mind you, this is a gay representative who doesn't seem to be super athletic. Maybe he is, I don't know. And that's the thing, sports just isn't, like, we're just not out there playing a game. Like, sometimes, yeah, of course you have like a pickup game or you have intramural where, yeah, okay, it doesn't matter quite as much. But we're talking about competition. There are things on the line for these girls. This is not just some little, like, oh, they just like to play sports because it's fun. No, this is not some sort of validation for them. For some of these girls, it's the only way they're going to college. Like, it's the only way that they're going to have certain doors opened for them. I mean, you look at all sorts of different statistics of the number of female CEOs who were college athletes or high school athletes. Competition in sports really do set people up well for the future. And no one's saying that these biological boys who want to play on the girls' teams can't play on a team. They're not disqualified from sports. They just have to play either on a co-ed team or a boys' team. They can't play on the girls' team. That's all that we're saying. No one's being denied any opportunity. They just can't kick girls off the girls' team.
Exactly. And I think that's so important to note too, with all the news headlines you see about transgender athletes are being banned from sports. No one is being banned from sports. You just
No
have to play
one.
on the
No
team.
one.
Yes, literally. You have to play on the team that aligns with your sex. That is all we were saying. We're not coming up with anything new. This has been what has been happening. And, we also saw KVJ dive into this whole idea again as she's telling the attorney that's defending girls that Title IX is discriminatory. And he broke it down so well, basically saying that you have this male. He's not allowed to play on the women's team, but you get the same male and he just says he identifies as girl and now he can play on the team. Like, what biologically changed? And let's watch this clip about KVJ and how Title IX is so discriminatory.
But they are being prevented from playing on the team that matches their gender identity, correct?
That's the effect. So let me use your example from earlier. You
Yes.
said there's a cisgender woman, she could play on the team she wants.
Right.
There's a boy who identifies as a girl, he can't play on the team he wants. Take that same boy and switch his gender identity, but say he still wanted to play on the girls' team. Say he was a very unathletic boy. He likewise couldn't play on the team. So it's not the gender identity that's keeping him off the girls' team, it's his biological sex. His gender identity is wholly irrelevant to it. Now, I agree with you, there's a very significant disparate impact on transgender individuals by this law because they're the boys who are most likely to want to play
Have
on
we
it.
said that Title IX never covers that kind of disparate impact in terms of its discriminatory effect?
Well, it certainly doesn't cover disparate. First of all, I don't think Title IX covers disparate impact, period, because it uses.
But in terms of its discriminatory effect, I'm just trying to understand it. Is there
Yes.
something to this notion that differential treatment in effect in this way could be something that Title IX cares about?
I don't think Title IX covers disparate impact even on the basis of sex, and it certainly doesn't cover disparate impact on the basis of gender identity.
Okay.
Again, this was one of the ones where I'm like, how is a Supreme Court justice saying this? But I'm applauding the attorney defending women because it's, first of all, to watch a woman say that Title IX is discriminatory towards people. I mean, that got women so far. And so what are you thinking when you heard all of this?
Yeah, I mean, the opening line of our brief is that Title IX is the great American success story. And I just want to, and Justice Kavanaugh even said it from the bench. And I just want to scream that at Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Like, what are you, like, part of the reason you are here is because of Title IX and all the innovations and all of the doors that were opened in the 60s and 70s. And it's just so bizarre to see what the side that has claimed women's rights, who's claimed to be feminist and stand up for women and all of this stuff, who's claimed all these things all these years, say, but never mind, now we're going to do all of this and we're going to hand it to men. What? Like, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The Solicitor General handled that question perfectly, really highlighting that this is not discrimination based on gender identity or transgender status or any of those things. We are just saying that biological sex, when it shows up in sports, it matters. And we have always said under our equal protection laws and under Title IX that that is okay and that is constitutional. And so the fact that we're having this round and roundabout like conversation about it that lasted 3.5 hours. I heard one podcast talk about it, like it should have been 15 minutes. And honestly, like it was over in 15 minutes. But this is such a clear the even how bizarre her question was made the truth so evident for everyone who wasn't ideologically captured in the courtroom. This doesn't make sense. And the real big questions they were grappling with are like, okay, it almost felt like we know where we are on this particular question, but what about the cases that are coming? And so that's really, I think, where this is headed and why it took so long to debate is, okay, what's coming next?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to, again, just props to the attorney on our side for that whole conversation. And I thought he broke it down great, but to take it a step further for people listening that are like, maybe on, I don't know, maybe not sure where they fully stand on some of these debates and conversations, think about it like this. If a grown man is in your 13-year-old daughter's restroom, like a public restroom at a park,
Mm,
and he pulls down his pants and exposes himself to her, that's not okay. But if that same grown man does that and pulls down his pants and exposes himself to her, but then says, "But I identify as a woman," that's still not okay. There is just a whole group of people that are saying that's okay. And
yeah.
so that's this whole ideology. It does things just don't change because you get to say what things are and things aren't. I mean, I think about it sometimes, Brittany, like, does that mean a 16-year-old can show up to a bar and they can say, well, my ID says I'm 20 or my ID says I'm 16, but I'm 22. I identify as 22. So I'm going to be allowed in here and be allowed to drink. I mean, the same thing applies.
I mean, then there's so many areas of our lives that, okay, I could just deny reality and say that, I am all sorts of things that are not true. And the age one is one of the most obvious ones of I can't just show up and say, oh, well, I'm now English and claim English citizenship or I'm a different age than I am. I think a lot of women who would start claiming that they're 22 again, like it's like, but that's not how life works. And that's not biological reality. And it's insanity to claim that it's not true. And then there are certain spaces that it matters and that it impacts other people's rights in this, especially when we're talking about the issue of sports and this, it's private spaces. And there are real women who are losing opportunities. They're losing spots on teams. They're losing championships. And as something that started coming up towards the end of the argument was the fact that, yeah, there might only be 5 transgender individuals that are competing in women's sports in West Virginia. But you know how many championships and medals and spaces those 5 individuals, and I'm making these numbers up, but these 5 individuals might be impacting? And, we have a lot of different studies that have showed that we're talking about even a handful of transgender individuals in women's sports lead to hundreds of lost trophies, of lost spots, and lost competitions.
Absolutely. I mean, I just think I played soccer, and if there was one male on my soccer team, that now affects, let's say, sometimes the teams, like you think about high school and college, have 25 to 30 players on it. Now, all those girls that are forced to play with a male are affected. You have 10 games playing against 10 different teams that also have 25 to 30 girls. Look how many people are so impacted by one person. And I think there was a lot of kind of conversation back and forth, Brittany, that it's, well, there's not even that many, so it's not impacting that many people. But then they would backtrack and kind of say, we need to support them and make sure that the boys have the support because there's a ton of them. And it's like, I don't know if you noticed that, but I kind of felt like they were going back and
Oh,
forth.
they were trying to have it both ways. For certain arguments, they were saying, "Oh, well, there's not that many of them, so it's not that big of a deal." But then they were also trying to say, and they're two different legal arguments that they're trying um, to cover. So they would say that when they were talking about, "Oh, well, they're not really impacting that many girls," but then they would say, "Oh, well, but they're a significant enough class that we can recognize them in the law." You can't have it both ways, and a lot of it comes down to whether, and this is a lot of detail, but whether it was an as applied challenge or whether it was a facial challenge, which means are we just challenging it as it's applied to this particular athlete, or is it for all athletes? And really, like, the ACLU wanted it to make it about these very particular defined athletes in order to try to get around to the fact that they're going to lose. Like, they were trying to carve out any way to win. And so like I said, it was like a magic show. Like, I'm going to make one argument over here when it affects this, but then I'm going to change it over here and you're not going to know what I'm doing. A lot of sleight of hand. And it was very obvious the justices were having none of it.
Mhm. And on that, there's one final clip I wanna watch of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and she's someone that I think a lot of people have been a little disappointed with her, on certain issues, certain things, but Let's just dive right into this clip.
You're just drawing the line based on biological sex and saying that trans girls can't be on the girls' team in an age group that's prepubescent.
The record in this case does not support the notion that males lack an athletic advantage at 6 years old. That's about as early as the science goes from what's in the record. And even at that age, males have about a 5% athletic advantage over girls in most situations. Now,
Okay, Brittany, Amy Coney Barrett, was using the other side's language, saying trans girls, things like that. I've heard people disappointed on that. I've also heard some people say, well, she was using the language that is actually in the writing. And so sometimes they just choose to go with what is actually in the case. Were you shocked by the language she was using? Was this something you even noticed? Because, I mean, there was just so much mumbo jumbo going on. What were your thoughts on Amy Coney Barrett for the day?
Yeah, and you saw this from quite a few of the justices. It wasn't just Amy Coney Barrett. And I think sometimes she gets a harder rap than she deserves. I think we have a lot of the conservative movement has a lot of expectations for her. So sometimes, especially being an attorney, like sometimes people will make claims about justices that it's just not how the court works. It's just not how the legal system is understood to operate. There is the way they talk is different, the way they operate is different. So sometimes I think that those claims have been over exaggerated or misunderstood. This was disappointing. Now, I can give some grace in the fact that the court's goal, they're not trying to make policy arguments, they are not trying to make any sort of broader cultural commentary. Their job is to be respectful and to figure out what the law is. And so there's a lot of deference that they'll have to sometimes language that, and you hear this other times in abortion context and other contexts, where they just use the other side's language. But the problem is, in this particular situation, the language is the whole battle. And we've seen this in court cases where attorneys have been forced to use female pronouns for males and vice versa, when that is literally the entire legal argument. And so you've kind of given away the farm before you've even gotten there because of the wording that is used. And so it was disappointing because there are really respectful ways and there are really accurate ways to talk about these things without absorbing the opposition's language. And I do this all the time, right? We have a transgender legislator in Kansas, and I have learned how to talk to this legislator and how to address this legislator in a way that I don't misgender the individual. I talk in very neutral, like there are ways to do it and to continue operating without lying and without being disrespectful. And sometimes the truth is can be perceived as disrespectful. I do want to put that out there. But I have to operate in a professional manner in my job. And I want to respect this individual as much as I can as a human being made in the image of God. And I do think that's what Justice Barrett was trying to do. I disagree with how she went about that. And so I do think that there was some ideological surrender there that didn't need to happen. And hopefully it's an opportunity for Justice Barrett to really think through how we talk about these things, because how our words matter. They do. And they set standards, they push culture, even if you're just trying to be respectful.
Absolutely. And I think as Christians, something I really try to focus on is when we start using this language, and if there's this boy who thinks he's a girl and we start calling him a girl or a trans girl, we are actually disrespecting the child made in the image of God as a boy. And so, like you said, there's a way to go about it. There's a way to approach it, but we shouldn't. I always feel that if we are switching up on the language just so we don't offend someone else with the truth, then we're basically apologizing for scripture, for the Bible, for God's word. And who are we to apologize for the perfect word God gave us? I mean, you have that angle as from a Christian, but for people that are listening that maybe aren't Christian, it's common sense. There's male and female. There's nothing different.
And we don't have to apologize for it. We don't have to make excuses for it. Yes, can we be kind and respectful and all of those things in the process? Yes. But that doesn't mean we surrender the truth. That doesn't mean that we back down from reality. And I'm sorry, telling a child that he's a boy when he's a girl, how psychologically damaging is that? Like, it's beyond my understanding why people think this is kind. And yes, I don't have to pick the fight every time I speak, but I do need to speak truth, right?
Yes, yes, I love that. And I do want to touch on the one other thing that she said in that video. She was really questioning this whole idea about like, well, what if the boy is pre-puberty, hasn't gone through puberty yet, things like that. I just the one thing I don't know if you have anything to say on that, Brittany, but the one thing I want to add is puberty makes a large difference. I remember playing soccer. We used to, when we were 11, 12 years old at practice, we'd scrimmage against the boys' teams just because it kind of helped us train. It was good to practice. But we started hitting 13, 14. It was no longer safe. Like, that's where it was like, hey, it's not
Yeah.
safe to play against the boys because they're going through puberty. They're bigger, they're stronger. But I want to note that the way that our bodies are made as male and females. I mean, our femurs are angled differently, which actually allows males to run faster because their bodies move different. That I mean, our hips are different as women because I mean that's why people always say the birthing hips and things like that. But it affects the
Lord
way
love
you
'em.
athlete. We also see the way our hearts are literally like different sizes, and so it allows males to pump blood through faster, which makes a difference when you're playing sports. And this has nothing to do with puberty. This is how we're made. And so I don't know if maybe she's just not informed all that, if she was just trying to poke questions. I don't know how that felt in the room, but
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things going on. There's a legal thing going on because they were, as I referenced, the as applied challenge that they were addressing. They were trying to say that if we have an athlete who's been doing puberty blockers for a year, or who has never gone through male puberty but is a male, if we have this specific subset of an athlete, is the law unconstitutional? Like, they were doing some weird, and as I think she was trying to address some of that and get to the root of some of that. And she specifically asked the question about, what about 6-year-olds? Like, why does the law apply to 6-year-olds? And that's a conversation we had in Kansas too. We had a legislator who wanted us to not apply the law until 6th grade. Well, first of all, the law allows for co-ed teams, which most teams under like the age of 12 are, depending on, what kind of sport it is. But when you start seeing puberty make a real difference, which is typically around 12 and 13, that's when we start dividing between men and women. But sometimes there are sports that are even younger that you need to divide because it's like you said, it's not just puberty that makes us different. I'm sorry, like there's a difference between a baby boy and a baby girl. And they haven't even hit puberty yet. There are things that are biologically wired into us from conception that are different. And my sister's pregnant with her first child right now, which is my favorite thing to talk about. So I have to bring it up. But, I went to one of her ultrasounds and they were talking about how long her femur is and like how that's different than a boy and all of those things in the womb. My nieces hasn't even been born yet and there's already distinctions. And you know what? We've always said those things are beautiful. We've always said the difference between men and women is a good thing and we should celebrate those differences instead of acting like there's some sort of evil thing. And no, we should be celebrating them. We should be rejoicing what the Lord has done. And it's a good thing that they show up differently in sports because you know what? I really enjoy watching women's gymnastics be women's gymnastics and men's gymnastics being men's gymnastic because they're two totally different sports, right? And not every sport is quite that distinct, but most sports, the way it shows up is a really beautiful thing. And it is so fun to watch because they are distinct.
absolutely. I mean, it even makes me think of soccer. I have 3 brothers. They all played soccer. I played soccer. A women's soccer game is very different than a men's soccer game. The speed of the game, the way it's played, it's the same sport, but it's played so differently. And I think it's fun to watch the differences. I mean, sometimes we even joke like, "Oh, the girls are tough because we would hit each other for 50-50 balls and get going." And you see the clips of some of the guys that are rolling around on the ground crying and stuff. So it's just a different way to play it. And it's beautiful and it's fun. And again, it's like you said, it's something that we should recognize and celebrate. But that was the clips that were just really stood out to me that I wanted everyone to hear and listen. But overall, Brittany, what was there any specific other lines that you want to get into, explain, or what you were feeling that day in the court, what you were hearing?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite moments was Justice Kavanaugh. We are an hour and a half in, and it is the first time any of the women have been even mentioned. No female athletes' names were mentioned. Riley wasn't mentioned. None of these women who've been telling this story for the last 5 years, not a single one of them was mentioned. But he mentioned women generally, and he mentioned the success that Title IX has been in revolutionizing women's place in society and the opportunities that women have had because of Title IX largely. And that was such a cool moment to just hear him. He's a coach, he's a dad of daughters, and you could hear that. You could hear he's thinking about the students he's coached. He's thinking about his daughters of this matters, their opportunities matter. And so after an hour and a half of only hearing about the boys' experience, it was just a beautiful thing to finally just have all the things that have been lost and all of the opportunities that we've really been fighting for, have those recognized. Truly give the advocates an opportunity to really address that issue and not just focus on the legal weeds or transgender status, to really look at what's being lost, and if we don't protect women's sports, what will happen.
Absolutely. And that was something I noticed too. For such a long time, you're listening to the oral arguments and you're like, they're not talking about us girls. They're not talking about the girls. And so it was disappointing to hear the lack of that, but then, like you said, really great when it finally was brought up. And I want to touch on too, you kind of mentioned this earlier. There was a lot of kind of what if situations playing out. And like you said, it's more so looking to how is this going to affect future cases, things in the future. What does that even mean? How would a Supreme Court ruling do that? Can you explain that?
And I think that's what is so challenging about Supreme Court arguments and them being so public. We are so used to our deliberative bodies like our legislatures, making policy decisions, making, these sweeping laws to some extent. These Supreme Court, courts they're focused on a very minute legal question. And when they answer that legal question, they generally don't address all the other legal questions that could come before them. And so this one particular question is, are these laws constitutional? Like, can states even pass these laws? But it's very clear, because we already know these cases are happening. And the advocate who was with the Solicitor General of the United States office, he part of the team that's already working on these cases. But there are cases in California and there are cases in Minnesota that are asking whether Title IX requires these types of laws. So then it would impose, to some extent, a law saying that boys cannot play in girl sports in states that haven't passed a law so far. And so they know that that's the next case that's coming before them. And so they really, you can tell they don't have a problem with saying that states can pass these laws. They're really thinking through what's going to happen when we get a case that says that states must pass these laws.
There you go. Yeah, it's so different because sometimes as a listener, you're just listening to the oral arguments, not even thinking about how they're thinking 2 steps ahead of what's to come. We're just like, answer this. And so, ultimately at the end of the day, like you said, the Supreme Court justices are going to rule whether or not states have the rights, whether or not they can protect girls' sports. And so after hearing the oral arguments and everything that's played out since that day, where do you think we're at with this? What do you think the results potentially could be?
And I have to be careful about speculating, especially when it comes to the court. But I think it's pretty clear. It's pretty easy, and lots of people will back me up on this. I think we can count to 5 at least. And so you need at least 5 to get a majority. So I think that it's pretty obvious we're going to win these cases. I think the bigger question for me is what Justice Gorsuch does. He is the justice who wrote the Bostock opinion about Title VII and employment discrimination for individuals who claim to be transgender, as well as for all the LGBTQ categories. And so there's some question about how he analyzes statutes, and he tends to have a soft spot for anyone that he thinks is being bullied in his book. And so it's always an interesting thing to see who the little man is that he is choosing to protect in any particular case. And I'm not alone in that analysis of Justice Gorsuch. I didn't come up with that. And so it was, some of his questions where it was difficult to kind of see where he was headed. So for me, he's the one that I'm not sure about. Justice Kagan seemed to be not majorly in opposition. I think she understands Title IX and understands the doors that it's opened, but she's also, she was appointed by a Democrat president and tends to be very liberal. So I think we have at least five. Well, I think it's hard to say exactly which way everyone will go, but I think that you have your five clear conservatives, including Justice Roberts. Justice Gorsuch is questionable. Justice Kagan is questionable, exactly where she lands. But Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson, I imagine, will write a dissent of some sort. And then we'll kind of see where the other two land. But I do think that we win this particular case. I think that it's going to be pretty clear that Title IX does protect and allow women to have women's only sports, as well as the Equal Protection Clause. It's not sex discrimination, and it's an exceedingly important purpose that states have in protecting women's opportunities in this way. But I think it'll be interesting to see, how does this apply to states that haven't passed a fairness women's sports? How does this apply to locker rooms and bathrooms? I think those are cases yet to be decided, and I'm praying those cases get to the court fairly quickly.
Yes, yeah, and I know there's a lot of people, I mean, I got asked this question a lot outside the Supreme Court of, "Well, you're from California, they have not put in a law to protect girls' sports. How does this even affect you guys? What does this matter to you?" And just from the policy angle, I said, if the Supreme Court rules correctly on this, and I stand by the fact that we have truth, we have science, we have the Constitution, and we have God on our side on this case. And so I'm pretty confident in how this is going to go. It now gives us, in states that haven't protected girls' sports, and mostly blue states, we can push on our legislators. The Supreme Court has ruled that you can protect girls' sports. Now, will you? And
Mm.
so it gives us that extra pressure to put on them and let them know, like, hey, it's not up in the air anymore about whether or not you can. You can. So protect us. And so it does matter to states that haven't been protected yet. And, we'll probably see this come out. People are saying maybe June we'll have the results. And so,
Yeah, they have to issue all of their rulings by July 1. And so normally the contentious cases come late June. And now, is this a contentious case? I don't know. It seemed like the answer is pretty obvious, but when you have a lot of different opinions that need to be written, it takes a while for them to go back and forth. Not because they're trying to decide, but when they are writing these large opinions, there's a lot of back and forth, and they want to make sure they check everything. So I would expect June. It could be earlier, but I would expect some sort of opinion in June.
amazing. And if anyone listening is like, I haven't listened to the oral arguments, I want to, where can I listen? I will have in the show notes, you'll be able to click on a link to listen to all three and a half hours of these arguments. But we really did walk through some of the most interesting statements made, the main points made here today. But Brittany, is there any last thing you would want the listeners to know about this case or the women's sports issue, anything like that?
I think that it is so important to recognize the shift we've seen in the last decade. I started working on this issue around 2018, and at the time, we weren't even sure the best way to write one of these laws. I remember being in a room with some friends on some national groups, and we thought we would lose, but we have to try something. And so we were trying to figure out how to craft one of these laws well. But what changed is that women started telling their stories. People like Sophia, people like Riley Gaines, and so many women started stepping up, started talking about how they were losing opportunities, started talking about what it was like to have a male in their locker room. And that's what changed the narrative. That's what got us to this day, is you had brave women like Representative Barb Ehart, who took a ton of heat when she introduced that law in Idaho in 2020. And so here we are in 2026. And we knew that we would reach this day eventually, but it is not without so many women being brave, being willing to speak out. And so I encourage everyone listening, if there's an issue on your heart, don't be afraid to talk about it. Are a team of people across the country who are probably with you. And so if you begin speaking, others will join you.
Absolutely. And for all those listening, if you are in California, reach out and I will help you on this issue. If you're in Kansas, reach out and Brittany will be able to help you on your girls' sports situation there. But we have friends and allies and coworkers across the nation. So wherever you're at, reach out. We want to help give you a voice, share your story, and stand up for girls' sports in your state and your city. And so, Brittany, what is the best way people can keep up with your work in Kansas? If it's social media, a website, where can people find out?
Yeah, so people are welcome to visit our website, kansasfamilyvoice.com. You can sign up for our weekly emails and our action alerts there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, especially this time of year where there's a lot going on. And we try to keep everyone apprised of all the various moving things that are happening in Kansas. So it's a lot of fun.
Amazing. And I'll have those all linked so you guys can check it out in the show notes. But Brittany, thank you so much for coming on and helping explain these 3-hour oral arguments into 1 hour, which is very difficult to do. So thank you so much. And thank you for all you are doing in Kansas.
Well, thank you, Sophia. Thanks for having me. And we love Family Council and all the work you're doing. And we're just so grateful for you.
Amazing. And with that, we'll see you all next time.